So this time I'm joined by my colleague and partner Laura Clews, and we're going to be discussing food innovation and things like alternative proteins. So think vegan sausage rolls, cell-cultured meat. So what I found really interesting this time was Laura discusses 3 key points that businesses who are working in the alternative protein sector should consider when developing an IP strategy.
I think when we meet new clients, particularly if they don't have much experience in IP, the main 3 aspects are strategy, confidentiality, searching.
Laura also mentioned some of the amazing innovation that's going on in alternative proteins, using things like blades of grass and leaves from trees as scaffolds for growing cell-cultured meat.
And that, I think, was possibly one of my favourite areas of this technology, because you have so many different companies all trying to get to the same end point, but they do it in completely different ways.
It's going to be a great and really interesting episode, so make sure you listen. So this time I'm joined by my colleague Laura Clews, who's a fellow partner here at Mathys and Squire. We're going to be discussing IP and patents in food innovation, and in particular in protein production. So just a little bit about Laura. Laura has extensive experience in the drafting and prosecution of patent applications in the UK, Europe and worldwide. You've been involved in patent opposition work and has experience in the management of patent portfolios. This isn't your first rodeo in terms of media appearances.
No.
You've had quite a few. You have shared your expertise in relation to the food IP in the food industry, appearing as a guest on the SEPA podcast. You've been an expert guest on a YouTube show, Adam Ragusier's YouTube show. I don't know if I said that
Ragusier.
right. Yeah, Ragusier. You have been on BBC Radio's The Food Chain. You've been on video series for Food Matters Live. So you're a pro.
I don't know if I'd go that far. I think one of the things that's important to me is in the food and drink industry, historically, there's been a lot of misconceptions about whether you can have a patent application and what you can protect. So all of these BBC Radio, YouTube videos is essentially me banging on my drum to try and say to people in the food and drink industry, you can get protection, you can get a patent application. Please just come and see us and find out. Most companies will do an hour free where they'll just go through all of your work and see what you can protect.
And that's so important, as we're going to hear today and hopefully touch on today, why it's so important that these companies should be considering their IP strategies. We discussed how the focus today is particularly on the protein industry and protein production. There's been quite a bit of discussion in the media recently about developments in the alternative protein industry. But what do we actually mean by that when we say alternative proteins, and what does it encompass?
So in a nutshell, alternative proteins are proteins formed from plant-based products, cell-cultured products. You have fermentation and insects, and essentially it is protein designed to mimic either meat or dairy products.
So is that, dropping some names here, things like Beyond Meat or Impossible Foods?
Exactly.
And, so some of these names that we will have heard of and perhaps tried and tasted.
Yeah.
Amazing. So what would you say has been the main focus in innovation in these areas in recent years?
In recent years, it's quite difficult because I feel like the alternative protein sector has massively expanded and come to the forefront of media in the last 10, 15 years, which is quite a short space of time. So thinking back really to the beginning, I would say patent applications were more focused on proof of concept. So really broad applications relating to food products or processes. So if you think back, you probably saw a post about Dr. Monk post in 2013 where he produced the first cell culture burger. Now that burger obviously was a brilliant proof of concept and showing how the technology can work. But it was reported that that burger cost over £200,000.
Wow.
So while it's brilliant technology, I think your average consumer going to the supermarket is probably not going to pay £200,000 for a burger. So when the technology moved on, it was more looking at how you make it more cost effective, how you scale up the process. And when you're looking at things like cell culture meat, initially what people were doing were producing a group of cells, essentially. And that looks like processed meat, so mince. So burgers are easier to produce than a cut of meat like a steak. And the reason for that is because for anyone who's had a steak, you'll know it has quite a fibrous texture. And in order to replicate that, you need to have the cells grow in the same direction in a very ordered way. So a lot of the technology then moves on to how can we produce scaffolds, how can we produce means of aligning these cells to make the fibrous kinds of texture. And that, I think, was possibly one of my favourite areas of this technology, because you have so many different companies all trying to get to the same endpoint, but they do it in completely different ways. So we saw universities growing cells on blades of grass. You had people,
really?
yeah, you had people decellularizing plant leaves to grow it in the veins of the plant to try and order it that way. You had universities using Lego to produce electrospinning techniques. You had 3D printing, which always feels really futuristic to me.
Yeah.
And then as technologies moved on a bit further, obviously there's always the more cost-efficient aspect of things, but we're more looking at now consumer acceptance, I would probably say, overall. So you're looking at the taste, texture, colour, moisture. I mean, you have things like, you mentioned companies like Impossible Foods, where they're producing heme using genetically modified yeast, and they put that in their plant-based burgers, so it looks like it bleeds like a regular
I've
burger.
heard of that. Yeah.
So it's, I think, more now it's looking at different cuts of meat and the overall experience, I'd say, when you're eating the product.
Amazing. I never would have, now you talk about it, it's like crazy how much innovation's gone on there. But, I wouldn't have thought of that, especially the growing on blades of grass or the leaves thing. That sounds
I think
amazing.
one of the best parts of this technology is how diverse it is. You create one problem and everybody's gone in a different direction, and it's all brilliant.
Yeah. It must be so interesting to work in that area.
It really is.
So you talked about sort of consumer acceptance. Is there also sort of different regulatory sort of requirements and acceptance in different territories, and has that evolved over time, and does it differ from country to country?
Essentially, yes. So alternative proteins, especially if you have cell culture meat, that's taken to be a novel food product, because when you look at the definition of meat in the Food Standard Agency, for example, it relates to the slaughter of an animal, whereas cell culture meat doesn't. So in each of the countries, you have to have these new regulatory approvals. And different countries have accepted this at different timelines. So the US was a very early adopter of cell culture meat. And now, hopefully, in 2026, the UK might have finished all their tests to assess the safety of these products and have our regulatory approvals in place.
So we might be using this next year.
Possibly.
Wow, crazy. And so how do you think has that fed into sort of IP strategies and patent filings? Has sort of that changed based on the different environment in different countries?
I think some of the research that we've looked into is how patent filings have varied over the years and in different countries, keeping in mind regulatory approvals and support by government and investors. And over the last 10 years, the number of filings overall have increased year on year. But I think what is interesting is, first of all, well, I should put a caveat in. So our research, obviously, we can only search certain terms, so we can't guarantee that we have absolutely everything.
Of course.
But it gives us a general idea of what's happening within this field. And from our research, what we've seen is about 70%, slightly more, of first filings are US, China, Europe, and South Korea. So looking at the US, they were a really early adopter of this technology, especially cell culture meat. And you can see their patent filings are higher in the earlier years, and they kind of peak around 2021, 2022, and are starting to decline slightly. And one of the reasons we were trying to look into why this might be, and the reasons why it might be, because they had such an early adoption, obviously you're counting on funding, and then it was allowed to be, it was approved for sale, I think around 2022, 2023. But in the US, obviously, there's not many countries around the world who have accepted the sale of cell culture meat. So their market, which they're able to sell to, is massively smaller than what would be expected at this point. Also in the US, they've faced a lot of conflict about cell culture meat internally. So you have states such as Florida and Alabama who have banned the sale of cell culture meat.
Wow. Okay.
And then you have other states such as Texas and I think Iowa who have more restrictions in place, so it becomes more expensive to sell cell culture meat. And I think it's possible that that has had some effect on the number of patent filings and investment within that area. Now, if you look at China and South Korea, in the earlier years, there wasn't as many patent filings, but very recently, there's been a massive spike in the number of patent filings in these countries.
Really interesting.
And I think looking into that, so South Korea, the government have invested 10 million in producing a technology hub, which is specifically directed to cell culture meat. And they have their first application for regulatory approval, which is, I think, the company is called Cell Meat. So that's expected to open the doors to approval for more products and then open the market in that country. So it makes sense that we would see a spike in the number of patent filings. And then looking at China, so we have there in 2022, I believe, the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs specifically highlighted in their 5-year plan the importance of plant-based meat and cell culture meat for food security, because in China they import an awful lot of food, so they want to be able to support themselves. Private investment, I think in around 2022 is about 135 million for novel foods, a large portion of which will be alternative proteins. And again, the government has invested 11 million in producing a technology hub specifically for cell culture meat and fermentation. And what I think would be interesting to keep an eye on in the future is, as additional countries have their regulatory approvals systems in place and the market kind of opens up worldwide for things like cell culture meat, how's that then going to affect the number of patent filings in the US? Is that suddenly going to increase as well? So I think it's interesting kind of to monitor how everything that's happening in the world is affecting the number of filings and where this technology is going to go.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you. That's so insightful.
It's a long answer.
Yeah, but lots of figures and statistics there. So yeah, really useful. Thank you. So it's clear that there's a huge amount of innovation going on. There's a lot of investment, and companies are protecting their IP in this space. Laura, why is it so important that companies in the alternative protein sector protect their IP? Particularly in the form of patents. But why is it the case that some businesses choose not to protect their innovations in the form of patents as well?
That 2 questions.
That's 2 in 1, yeah.
Okay, so answering the first one first, why is it important to protect your IP? I think as we've discussed in the last 10, 15 years, the alternative protein sector has massively increased. And it's been predicted that in 2029, this sector is going to be worth around 25 billion. So it's for companies that are successful in this area, it can be extremely lucrative. Now, despite the fact that consumers have really driven the point that they want more environmentally friendly foods, they want food security, and it needs to be, healthy and things like that, they're really picky. Consumers are really picky about what they'll eat. It has to look right, it has to taste right, it can't be too dry or too wet, and it has to be the correct price point. And so in order to produce these products, there is so much innovation and research and funding and time dedicated to produce this product. Now, if you actually have a product that you think the consumers are going to like and buy, it's really important to protect your innovation, because once it's gone to market, you don't want a third party basically trying to reverse engineer your product and piggyback on all that time and funding and effort that you've taken to actually produce that product. So it's really important to try and protect that market share, especially when you have so many new companies in the same space and there is a lot of competition. In terms of why companies in the alternative protein sector might not protect their IP, Sometimes it can be because a lot of these companies are startups, and so they might not have come across intellectual property before. So they might not have, it might not have even been a consideration. And what we see a lot is it's of a lower importance, especially when you have a limited funding and you have to fund your research and do the marketing and create your packaging. Intellectual property can go down on the level of importance. And companies tend to think that, well, I'll just deal with that later. Which, as you know, it's awful when people do this because once they've sold their product, any information that you can glean from that product through analytical techniques is considered to be disclosed. Anything that you've put on marketing is considered to be disclosed, and then you can't at a later date protect that information. So sometimes it is just companies aren't aware of these pitfalls and when they need to do it. It might be, as mentioned earlier, this common misconception in the food and drink industry that you can't protect food and drink products or processes of manufacture, which is not correct. I mean, it can be in the alternative protein sector. People are a little unsure about what they can protect relating to proteins or cell culture meat, fermentation. So there can be a little bit of confusion there. Now, traditionally, I say traditionally, but there has been some really big, well-known cases where companies have relied on trade secrets. So like you have your Coca-Cola and KFC. So some companies may decide to rely on trade secrets because it's cheaper and easier to implement.
And potentially longer lasting.
And
I guess.
potentially longer lasting. But what companies need to know is that trade secret doesn't provide you any protection if you can reverse engineer that product, or if the same or a similar product is made by a third party. So looking at reverse engineering, as analytical techniques are getting better and better every year, it's more likely that people can get more information about your product and what it contains just from standard techniques. So it becomes more of a risk that somebody can reverse engineer your product. And when you're thinking about alternative proteins, it has expanded so rapidly in a short space of time, and there are so many companies all trying to reach the same end goal that it does become more likely that another person might create the same or a similar product. And so trade secrets become maybe a less effective means of protecting your intellectual property. Now, if I just add one tiny thing extra. One thing that is specific to the food and drink industry is in the UK, we have food labelling requirements. So if your innovation relies on the inclusion of, say, heme that you've used by genetically engineering yeast,
You've got to list it on the...
You have to list it on the food label. So it might be that you're not able to rely on trade secrets at all.
Wow. Okay, and that's why you're out here banging your drum, educating startups and saying, like, this is actually an area you should be innovating in, and these are the risks if you don't pay attention.
Yeah, it's when people are, in a startup and they might not have worked with intellectual property, you'll know yourself how heartbreaking it is to have to tell people that at a later date you cannot protect this work, because you can see, we've been discussing all the different scaffolds. You can see how innovative people are and how much time and effort that must have made. And you desperately want people to be able to get the protection that they deserve.
Yeah. So just on that point, I guess, if you are, say you're approached by a startup in this sector, what would establishing an IP strategy, an intellectual property strategy look like?
So what we want to do is look at what is the underlying invention for all their products. So what is the key aspect that you might be using in many different food products? Don't focus on, just a burger. If you're also using the same, say the invention is a particular ingredient, you can also use it in sausages, chicken, eggs, whatever. So you want to focus on what the key aspect is and get the protection for that, because it be a broad form of protection, both for what you're doing now, but you want to ensure that the protection that you're getting enables the scale up and future development if possible. And you also want to look at realistically, where are you planning to manufacture this product? Where are you realistically planning to sell this product? Because the temptation is to try and protect everything in every jurisdiction, and that gets really expensive really quickly. But if you have a plan on what the key technology is and where you're planning to manufacture and sell, you can limit the expense it is to protect your intellectual property. And for companies that are, for example, startups, but also any company doesn't want to spend money unnecessarily, it can really focus your spending and then create room for budget in other places such as marketing.
I mean, it has to be sustainable, right? You can't spend all your money on IP.
No.
But you do need to spend some money on your IP.
Yeah,
And
but you can do it in a really strategic way. And if you think about it really early on, we can possibly talk about this later, but focusing on things like searching and other aspects to really strategically make sure that what your IP is, can follow through to grants and really help you protect your market share.
So let's expand on that point then now, briefly. So you talk about searching and sort of building on that, Pete. What would you mean by that, and what could you do to sort of help on that strategic side?
I think when we meet new clients, particularly if they don't have much experience in IP, the main three aspects are strategy, confidentiality, searching. So in terms of strategy, we said you can, if you've got a good strategy in place, even if it's just an outline really early on, that can be really effective for your budgeting. But also when you're looking at investors, to show that you've thought about intellectual property can really help attract investors. Yeah. And when you've identified what the key aspects are of your invention, it helps with maintaining confidentiality, because then that specific information, you can limit the number of people who have access to it, password protected, make sure if you have to talk about it, you have an NDA in place. And then it just helps to prevent accidental disclosure of information that you would need to be confidential in order to either get a patent application or have an effective trade secret. And the third aspect is searching. So we'd always encourage people to undertake a search really early on. As important it is to think about your intellectual property, you also need to know what everyone else's intellectual property is. So once you've started developing your product, do a search, see what everybody else has got, because what you don't want is to be at a point where you've done all of your time and put all of your investment into developing a product and refining it, and then finding out that at the end point, your product falls within somebody else's patent application, and you either can't protect it or you have to look at licensing. Whereas if you do it at a really early stage, and you find out that potentially your product might fall within somebody else's patent application, okay, you might want to reach out and see if you can get a license, or you might be able to find a workaround so you don't fall within their IP, and then follow that through. So it's just much more cost effective to know what everybody else's IP is at a really early stage.
Amazing. So what were those three considerations again?
That would be strategy, confidentiality, and searching.
Strategy, confidentiality, and searching. Amazing. Thank you. So changing tack slightly, sustainability is a common issue. And I think a lot of people, when they think of alternative protein, sustainability is in mind, and the environmental impact and so on. When food businesses, they're marketing these products as sustainable or extra healthy, are there any considerations they need to have, when protecting or publicising their brand?
I think possibly it goes back to food labelling requirements. So where we had plant-based foods really early on, things like sausage rolls, plant-based sausage rolls, the main consumer...
I still haven't tried. Have you had one?
I know I have had one.
Okay, I haven't had one yet.
The main concern was that there was a lot of additives considered to be in there, or a lot of chemical sounding names, which for health conscious consumers can be quite off-putting. So if you have a product where it's obviously limited number of ingredients and they're easily recognisable ingredients for a consumer, that can be a massive selling point.
Yeah, so important. That's really interesting. So Laura, we're getting towards the end of the session this week. Just to sort of finish and round things off a little bit, what steps can innovators in this field take to ensure they maintain a competitive edge in a market that's so competitive as this one?
I think trying to rattle off a few bullet points, I think just having a conversation really early on about IP, what you can do. I think doing the searching really early on. And I think for another consideration is having an IP audit at some point.
Great
Because
advice.
IP audits look at what your business strategy is your intellectual property that you have in line with your business strategy. And it'll point out if there are any holes. And if there are, they're normally easily rectifiable. And I think that, again, having an IP audit and looking really tactically at what IP you have, how it aligns with your business and how you want it to grow is, again, really attractive to any investors.
Yeah, I think, as you said earlier on, there's a lot of misconceptions in this field about what can and can't be protected. It's clear with the level of innovation that's going on, you can't afford to ignore IP, and it's
No.
something that you definitely need to protect, whether that's with patents or otherwise. But, definitely seek some professional advice.
Yeah. And as I said, a lot of companies will give you an hour for free and just talk through what you've got and what you might need to think about.
Amazing. Laura, it's been so interesting. Lovely speaking with you. And hopefully I'll be eating some cell culture meat next year.
Hopefully.
Thanks.
Thank you.